Hello and welcome, Latin America. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Chris Borales, and I'm joined here by my colleague, Peter Steyer. Do you want to introduce yourself, Peter?
Yeah, hi, I'm Peter Steyer. I'm the Senior Solution Architect Manager, responsible for a broad range of SecOut products. Chris?
Great. Thanks, Peter. And I should have introduced myself as well. My name is Chris Borales, part of the product team for FortiNDR. So we're going to be talking to you about FortiNDR and network detection and response in general today. So really, I have a little or a short slide deck that I like to share with everyone. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And you should be seeing right now everything you want to know about NDR. So Peter and I both have a long history of working in the network detection and response space. So we're going to talk about really the need for network detection and response. So it really comes down to sort of, when we look at sort of the legacy of network defense or security operations, really we're looking at defending a scenario similar to what what medieval kings and queens and what they would do when they're trying to defend their castle. So if we're looking at these historical defenses, really what we have is something very similar to what we have with the modern network architecture. We have sort of a hardened perimeter that is designed to keep out, the bad guys out, so to speak. So we have things like moats, towers, arrow slits, walls, etc., that were used as technological advances to keep these, to safeguard what was happening inside the castle walls. And again, this is very similar to what we have with modern network architecture, where we have this sort of hardened perimeter, but then what happens if the attacker gets inside and past those perimeter defenses? That is really where network detection and response excels. So if we look at maybe a ransomware attack scenario like we have here, what do we do when the attacker gets inside those walls? So here in this scenario, this is something very simple, just sort of a generic version of a ransomware attack. So when we have this, the attacker might have 3 ways that they can get in, but there are a number of different ways that they can get in, right? This one shows credential phishing or compromised third-party credentials, maybe some externally facing server application that's misconfigured, or they could be using an initial access broker. However they get in, they have bypassed our perimeter security defenses, and now they're inside the network. So what are they doing when they're in there? This is where they really have a lot of latitude in what they can do. Now, this is sort of going to go sequentially. It's going to go and say, step 2, step 3, step 4, but they don't necessarily have to go in this order. But what we see in general is that maybe they, once they're inside, they distribute a loader to various hosts across the network. Then they go ahead and maybe they can download and execute a second stage payload from a known malicious or maybe a malicious website. They might download command and control payloads, etc. So they can download that sort of second stage payload, and maybe it calls out to a known command and control server that's out there. What they can do next is maybe they escalate their privileges. Maybe they go from sort of normal user access to privileged access. So they might get admin credentials somehow. And they move laterally throughout the network. As they're doing this, they're evading sort of standard network detection or sort of standard detection tools. While doing this, they may be leveraging tools that are used by your own network administrators. So they're evading sort of the standard detection methods. They can also exfiltrate data. And then lastly, only after all of these steps are concluded do they then execute the ransomware, and then the organization is then extorted. So we have a broad range of activity that's happening on the network before that ransomware even gets launched. So what does this mean? This means that if we take a look at all of the purple items that we see here in this sort of life cycle of an attack, we have ample opportunity to find attackers based on this activity. So how do we do that? This is sort of flipping that whole paradigm on its head a little bit. I know Peter and I, we usually talk about, or we hear a lot that the defenders have to get it right 100% of the time and the attacker only has to get it right once, right? We hear that a lot. But really what we're doing with network detection and response is we're flipping that paradigm around and saying the attacker has to get it right every one of these stages in order to not get detected. And the defender only has to get it right one time and see evidence of that malicious activity inside the network in order to find them. So I'm going to pass it over to Peter, who's going to talk a little bit about how we find the attacker behavior using what we call threat hunting, and we usually call it hypothesis-driven threat hunting. So Peter, can you talk us through hypothesis-driven threat hunting a little bit, really where it comes into play with network detection and response?
Yeah, I appreciate that, Chris. And yeah, that's a great example as we look at what's happening here, right? So let's make sure we have the screen shared again.
Yep.
And then the big thing here is when we start look at and discover within the network. I mean, a lot of it is, we can go back all the way back to when we were in school using that scientific method, right? That first process or that first step is to formulate that hypothesis. Once you're doing that, it's simple. You're going to use your NDR and you're going to conduct a search, right? Did this happen or did this not happen in my environment? Now, what's key here is if it does not happen or you do not see results from that search, you go back and you may formulate or change your hypothesis here. The whole idea is that you want to get a question where you're getting information back, right? So, okay, now what happens if it happens and it is true? This is where things get a little more interesting because we really want to take the information and call pivot or expand the scope. We may initially be looking at the past 7 days of data, looking for something that is malicious in a network, right? Or going to a bad destination IP address. Well, that's great. It happened in the last 7 days. I only have one host. Well, let's look at the last 30, 60, or 90 days of information to see where it hits. Or even go back further. Let's go back 365 days and figure out, did this happen in my network over the past year? And this is where NDR really becomes critical. From there, we're going to create investigations. Once those investigations prove to find malicious behavior and understand the full scope, we can take that information and develop new detection content. That means if it happens again, rather than having to threat hunt for it, let the system tell you that it happens again, and now you know how to defeat it and press on.
A little bit about what are some of those hypotheses that we're looking for? Are we looking for evidence of lateral movement, or are we looking more granularly about these? What are we typically looking for when we talk about these hypotheses that you may be a security analyst or whoever is looking at?
And that's a great question, right, Chris? Because a lot of times when we look at threat hunting and that capability, it's not what we call like a tier 1 or a tier 2 analyst. Tier 1 are is this a detection real or not? Tier 2 being the incident responders. Usually you have a tier 3, tier 4 team that is doing nothing but threat hunting, looking for new tactics, techniques, and procedures the adversary is using. Now, a lot of them are intel analysts by trade. That means they're going to be looking either for information that they get from an outside source, such as a government agency, a friendly within the intel space. You'll find out that a lot of threat analysts actually talk to each other behind the scenes because they're all fighting the same adversary. So if one guy or one individual sees it inside of their environment, they may say, hey, we saw this. We think it's malicious. Is this occurring in your environment, right? And it allows them to quickly go, hey, yes, it is occurring in my environment, or no, it's not occurring in my environment. You're maybe isolated to that individual organization. And it's good to understand that it could be something as simple as that. Or you could be going completely off of a whim and go, hey, let me look at all my remote SSH connections coming into my network. Okay. It could be a very broad task. Or let me look to see if I have any internal hosts talking to internal hosts, and then Okay, those are pretty normal, let's say, file servers, right? But if you start seeing, hey, why is my finance workstation now talking to an asset called development code?
Right.
I have an issue. Why is finance talking to a code server? I should never see that.
All right, so it looks like we're getting a few questions in from the audience. And please, audience members, feel free to ask questions as we're going. Our team here is trying to simultaneously translate and answer the questions live as we're going. But we have a question from Pablo here who's asking about where does NDR fit into the modern SOC? So Peter, we talked a little bit about threat hunting and everything, but where does NDR fit in with the sort of the host of other SOC tools that are out there?
Yeah, and that's a great question, Chris. I mean, you talked about, how we look at it from a traditional defense perspective. When we look at like a SOC or a SecOps organization, we start diving deeper, right? Everyone's familiar with your SIMs, your EDRs, these standard SOC tools that have been around for a while, such as endpoint protection. And really, when we start going through it, to include deception, such as FortiDeceptor, which we'll talk about later as well, NDR provides us the capability of looking at the network, right? I would love to say I can install EDR everywhere in an environment, but I know that's not always true. And we also know that the adversary has to live on the same network we do as defenders, right? That's the one thing they can't change. So NDR gives us that visibility of the network side, just like we have on the endpoint with EDR.
Yeah, that's great. And when we take a look a little bit of the statistics on how those attackers are looking at or living off the land, so to speak, we actually see that we can see that it's taking SOC teams up to, or on average, 281 days to identify and contain a data breach. This is a long time for them to be living off the land, conducting all of those activities that we talked about earlier through that sort of ransomware scenario. 281 days, you can imagine that you need to have solutions that allows your SOC team to be able to analyze this historical data and look for evidence of attacker behavior. Now, the next statistic that I like to bring up is regarding visibility. So what we see is that 69% of SOC analysts actually cite lack of visibility into the network traffic as the top reason for SOC ineffectiveness. What does that mean? If your SOC analysts can't see into all of the network, if they have maybe lack of visibility into maybe OT devices or IoT devices, or maybe work from home users, etc. If you have these network blind spots, they can't do their jobs effectively. They can't see into these blind spots. They need a way to do that. Next, we see that 84% of SOC analysts rank minimization of false positives as the most important SOC activity. Now, we all hear about high rates of false positives. We hear about the need for detection tuning. We hear about sort of analyst burnout on a day-to-day basis. Why is this? Because our tools are generating lots and lots of alerts, but really this should be on the vendor side. The vendor should take responsibility for this to make sure that their products are creating high fidelity alerts, not just alerting on on everything, and creating that sort of high false positive. So we want to make sure that whatever network detection response tool that you're working with, it is reducing those false positives. It's taking those proactive steps to reduce the false positives. And lastly, we see that 52% of SOC analysts report that they need more out-of-the-box tools. What does that mean? They need things that are at their fingertips. They need tools that help them create more succinct and more thorough investigations. So all of these things, the extended dwell times, don't have to be an advantage for attackers. We can flip that paradigm. We talked about that. If the attacker's been on the network for a long time, the defenders can use that to their advantage. They need to have visibility. SOC analysts need that visibility. It's crucial to their operations and their effectiveness. The false positives should be on the vendor's side. We need to be able to do things to help reduce that, not put the burden on our SOC teams that we're working with. And lastly, we need to be able to provide tools out of the box in the product that help create more succinct and thorough investigations. Now, Pablo asked about, where does NDR fit? But I think I'll turn it over to Peter here. We can talk about sort of the SOC visibility triad and where NDR fits exactly. So this is sort of the visual representation of that. Peter, why don't you go ahead and take it away?
And Chris, that's a great segue into this, right? Because when we start looking at it, everyone's very familiar with SIM, right? The SOC visibility triad isn't something we created. It is something coming from Gartner circa 2018-ish when this came out. And what it comes from is, we've had SIMs around forever, right? They've been around for a very long time. Early 2000, right? We've known the importance of having those log capabilities. So as we look at that, right, that's their foundational need. From there, we've expanded and started looking at the endpoint side. We started going down the EPP in the EDR segments here and looking at creating the wedge on the other side here of that SOC visibility triad, right? But that's going to be assuming I can have an EDR agent across that device, right? And then the last piece, right, is going to be NDR, right? Because what happens, like you mentioned, Chris, with those devices that we don't have visibility with, such as work from home, we look for IoT, OT devices, legacy systems that just simply cannot install an EDR agent on, right? And from there, this is where NDR fits. And this fills that gap, right? To me, when I look at this, I call it a three-legged stool, right? The biggest thing to look about it from our standpoint is, look, I need all three to ensure complete visibility. If I take one of those legs away, whether it's SIM, whether it's EDR, or whether it's NDR, the stool is going to fall over and cannot stand on its own. So from a SOC perspective, if I'm an analyst, if I want to ensure I have complete SOC visibility, I want all three tools.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, we mentioned this earlier, but really we are able to leverage that network metadata to our advantage and use that sort of use that perceived strength on the attacker side. So using sort of native tools that might be being used by your administrators and using that against them, so to speak. Now, I think we have another question coming in from the audience. I believe this is from Karen. She is asking about what's the primary use case for NDR? What do you think, Peter?
Yeah, so when we look at like the primary use case of NDR is, I can think of two. One is proactive threat hunting in the environment to see what's occurring, to see if I'm missing a trigger or detection. The other is investigative, right? It's the ability to look back. Maybe I am getting a detection from my NDR. Maybe I'm getting a detection from my EDR or another correlation point, such as my SIM, like we were talking about that SOC visibility triad a few seconds ago. Mm-hmm. What it allows me to do is say, what does the network tell me happened around this particular IP address, destination, source? It could be a file type. It could be a file hash. What are we looking for? And did this really occur on my network? And if it did, who else then touched this, right? So you're expanding that scope, right? So when you start talking network detection and response, that response capability is really the ability to investigate and make an educated decision of how bad the incident is within the network.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really think this is sort of, when we mention things like proactive threat hunting, this is something that is security operations. This is sort of on the upper, I'd say maybe the upper to intermediate level of security maturity is where we're seeing this. But to that point, NDR isn't just limited to those organizations with that higher level of security maturity. I think when we want to be able to see into that network activity, we want to make sure that all of our SOC analysts have that access and have that visibility. Like we talked about those statistics, being able to increase that visibility for your SOC analysts, being able to provide that tooling that we had talked about, that's something that all of your analysts can benefit from. And it's something that it's not just sort of reserved for the tier 3, tier 4 analysts that are doing the proactive investigations and threat hunting, but it's also helping those analysts sort of make sure that they have their bases covered. They can detect some of this anomalous traffic that's happening out there.
And that's a great point, Chris. When organizations start looking for an NDR tool, they're going to want something that can share the experience, the queries, and the knowledge base from their senior analysts down to their junior analysts, right? We always want to up-level our junior level analysts, even our maturity, and have a tool that can grow with the maturity in the organization. I don't want to have have an NDR for one type of organization and a different NDR for a different organization. Really, I really want is something that can grow with that organization as they mature.
Yeah, absolutely. So the next thing I want to talk about a little bit is the metadata. So what exactly, what is network metadata? What does it help us see? We've been touching on this sort of sporadically throughout the entire presentation, but when we talk about metadata, how important is it for network detection and response? I believe that, it is crucial to network detection and response, right? So when we look at the metadata, this is just sort of a snippet of the, what do you say, Peter, maybe thousands of metadata attributes that we analyze with FortiNDR and in FortiNDR Cloud. So when we're looking at this, it is crucial that you're analyzing the right data. So this, we on the FortiNDR side and FortiNDR Cloud side, we are collecting that network metadata from common network protocols. You see here, DNS, HTTP, RDP, SMP, etc. We can conduct payload inspection and analysis. We can conduct heuristics and leverage machine learning to analyze this metadata. So we are employing a lot of analysis techniques on this metadata, but the metadata is crucial. And we are, with FortiNDR Cloud and with FortiNDR Cloud, we are storing this metadata for 365 days, so you have access to it. We talked about that sort of extended dwell time that the attackers are using, that 281-day statistic that I mentioned earlier. If the attacker is on the network for that long, you need to have a repository of metadata that allows you to analyze historical network activity to do that, to find that evidence of attacker behavior. If you've had 280 days, et cetera, that you have to sift through in order to find that evidence. Now, if we're looking at specific techniques, so if we're looking at things like lateral movement, or we're looking at data exfiltration, Peter, can you go through a little bit of some of the stuff that some of the specific types of tactics, techniques, procedures that you're seeing from the analyst side?
Yeah, from an analyst side, this is really interesting when we start looking into lateral movements. It's odd because we still see a lot of similar attacker behaviors that we've seen for a very long time, right? I mean, red teams use Cobalt Strike as an example, as a means to get lateral movement within the organization. Well, so does the attacker, so does the adversary, right? So that is something we see quite a bit. We still see things like Eternal Blue, right? In Blue Keep, things that have been out there since, 2016, 2017, they're still persistent in the wild because we know that the adversary is effective with it. So they're not going to change their technique. From there, we're seeing a lot of command and control type activity, right? Beaconing outside of the network. Hopefully it's not within the network, but it doesn't mean it can't reside within the network. That doesn't mean the adversary can't set up shop and live on a single host and make that the communication point from all the other infected devices within the network. Other things that we really see that is interesting is privilege escalations and using tools in an environment that an administrator will use, such as PS exec or RDP. And that becomes really crucial because those are really hard to understand. When they start using tools that are already native into the hosts, such as PS exec in a Windows environment, RDP for a Windows environment, anything that's doing like SSH, things that you allow within your environment, you have to be an understanding of what do we allow, who do we allow it from, what is appropriate usage of that tool. Because you're going to end up with an environment that allows that sprawl to occur, to include like fileless service creation, right? Things of that nature that can spread laterally. So ensuring that, admin credentials are locked down appropriately. Only people with admin rights can do that. They have to sign in separately as an admin when they do something versus when they're their normal user. All of these capabilities, when we talk about normal behaviors in environment, good hygiene, right? Again, keeping that initial exterior wall that we've built through time functioning, we need to still keep it there, even though we do have tools like an NDR in place.
Yeah, absolutely. And Speaking of another technique, we also have, when we look a lot about, when people ask us about NDR capabilities, everyone asks us, can you detect data exfil? Is data, because obviously once data is exfiltrated, the attacker's almost on their way. They've almost conducted their, they've almost finished their mission. So you want to be able to stop this, obviously beforehand, but you want to be able to detect this activity. So when we're looking at, that ability to detect data exfiltration, really what we can do is we can look at things like large data transfers, maybe outbound FTP or TFTP. We can look up we can find instances of high percentage uploads, WinSCP activity, et cetera, that you see on the slide. But this is something that network detection and response, because like Peter mentioned earlier, the attacker cannot escape the network. They have to use the network. If we can see evidence of this activity, of data exfiltration, we can prevent it. We can stop it. So again, this is something where NDR excels at, and it is something that our customers rely on network detection and response to find evidence of this activity. Now, I think we have one more question. I believe this is from Adrian. So I believe the question is, who are the primary users of NDR for NDR on the SOC team? So who's using it, Peter? Like when we talk, we've said the word analyst a lot, but who is using NDR really?
Yeah, so I mean, analyst is kind of a generic term, right, within the SOC, right? You may have a team that is your generic alert detection individuals, right? Their primary goal is to look at a detection or an alert that comes in from multiple tool sources. Usually all this information is going to be pumped into a single pane of glass, such as a SIM or a SOAR, right? And they're going to use that as a first point. It's pretty straightforward, right? So the analysts themselves may have access at that level to NDR just to validate, is this detection real or not, right? So it's the availability of seeing that. And just because we see it on the NDR side, I may want to cross-reference that with something from an EDR side to validate that it was installed there if there is an EDR or EPP agent there. The next thing is when we talk about incident response, that's going to be your tier 2. Those are the people like, we validated this detection is real. Now I need to escalate this to the actual responders, and we go through response procedures. Now, every organization is going to be different. Your tier 1 and tier 2 may be the same organization, and that's fine, right? Every organization goes through a security maturity model that fits for them. And a lot has to do with, okay, maybe I'm using an MSSP as tier 1, and that's perfectly fine as well, right? Having that availability of them going back and go, hey, this is real. Now, it gets passed back over to your team to do that incident response. And then the final piece really becomes to, like you were saying earlier, Chris, a very mature organization. When you have a threat intel and a threat hunting team, usually as part of that, they're responsible for like detection creation across multiple tool sets as well. So that's a very, very mature organization. And a lot of organizations just aren't there. And that's fine. Like I said, even like large enterprise organizations, that's even hard for them to sustain for long periods of time.
Absolutely.
And it's, where does it fit and how does it solve that, and what the users are doing it, right? I would say it's any analyst, and I know that's an interesting, but I'd say a security analyst within the organization that's responsible for identifying a threat and then doing the response for the threat. That's always that first part. Who's going to use it? Probably would say 80 to 90% of the time. And then if the team does have a threat hunting or a threat intelligence type organization, that tier 3, tier 4, depending upon how the organization's broken up, then they may use it as well to help tune and create their own detections based upon what they're seeing in the wild from other organizations.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, we talk network detection and response today, but remember, NDR is a facet of a host of several tools, or a host of a suite of tools, really, that make up the security operations center. So we talked about SIM, we talked about EDR, EPP today as well, and then we have NDR here. But we also have things like FortiDeceptor that is going to provide, it's basically honeypot type of assets for attackers to find on the network as fake resources that they should, that can be monitored. That's something that we're going to be talking about a little bit next week. But these are all parts of a larger SOC ecosystem that we have a host of tools that requires just as many experts in order to run and leverage for really this effective SOC, this very mature security operations center that we talked about. Now, last thing, we're wrapping up here. So we really talk about why network detection and response. What is the need? Why the need for network detection and response? And I think it really boils down to, we have this host of sophisticated threats that are out there. We talked about how attackers can hide on the network, in network traffic, use network tools. That is one reason, of course. But we also have these visibility gaps that exist across the network. So these network blind spots that I mentioned earlier, we have these areas where maybe OT, IoT, work from home devices, etc., that the security operations center can't necessarily see. And then lastly, we have this huge increasing volume of network data that's being generated by these disparate networks. So we have sort of public, private, hybrid cloud environments. Maybe we have an OT environment in there as well, or a host of IoT devices. All of these disparate devices, we need to be able to analyze all of this traffic at once, and we need to be able to do it with low false positives. How do we do that? NDR is a tool that we leverage to do that. It is something that I believe is critical and crucial for an advanced or intermediately advanced security operations team, and we need it in order to find that evidence of attacker behavior on the network so that we can root them out and make sure that they are not living off the land and sort of hiding in plain sight for us. So with that, I'll go ahead and we can conclude there. But I really want to say thank you to everyone for joining us today. I really hope you found this interesting. Thank you so much, Peter, for joining me on this presentation. And with that, I believe we'll wrap it up. So thank you again, everyone. And we do have some questions I believe that are still going on, and please join us next week for when I believe we'll be talking about FortiDeceptor. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks all.